With more than 6,000 small and micro-cap companies listed, if you're looking for the next apple at the earliest stage, then Channel Check truly is the orchard. The listed companies support Channel Check, so it's free for you, the potential investor, to gain access to institutional quality research from FINRA licensed analysts, advanced market data, industry reports, news, and a growing catalog of videos and webcasts. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and register for Channel Check so you're always up to date on what's going on at the small and micro-cap data place. Welcome to this special edition of this C-Suite series presented by Channel Check and Noble Capital Markets. Noble is an SEC-registered, FINRA-licensed broker-dealer and the source of the equity research available on Channel Check. This investor forum at the World Stem Cell Summit presentation features Mesoblast, NASDAQ ticker symbol MESO. Following a brief overview presentation from CEO and Managing Director Dr. Silviu Itescu, Noble Senior Research Analyst Robert LeBoyer will moderate a Q&A session. If you registered for this event through channelcheck.com, in the coming days you'll be given an opportunity to get your own questions answered by the company. With that, I am pleased to present Dr. Silviu Itescu.
Thank you for having us at the World Stem Cell Summit 2021 Investor Forum. So Mesoblast is developing two platform technologies. Our first generation platform is based on a product that we call remestemcel-L. Our second generation is immunoselected cells using a platform called rexlemestrocel-L. The remestemcel-L platform targets diseases of severe inflammation whereby the product is delivered intravenously. Our lead indication is pediatric refractory acute graft-versus-host disease, where we are in the process of a regulatory pathway to approval of our first product in children. Our second major indication is acute respiratory distress syndrome due to COVID-19. A large trial has completed randomized controlled, and I'll be updating you on the results of those. In addition, we're focusing the product in other areas of systemic inflammation, including biologic refractory inflammatory bowel disease. In Japan, the product for graft-versus-host disease has been approved and marketed through our strategic partnership with JCR Pharma. We have a relationship with Novartis that is expected to close in the short term. Moving forward, the second generation product, rexlemestrocel-L, is being developed for two major indications, both by local delivery: severe advanced chronic heart failure and severe refractory inflammatory back pain. The cardiovascular program in China is partnered with Tasly Pharmaceuticals, and the back pain product in Europe and Latin America is partnered with Grunenthal. Mechanism of action of our platforms relates to the ability of the cells to sense severe inflammation through various surface receptors that are bound and activated by inflammatory cytokines such as interferon gamma and TNF alpha. And following activation by these inflammatory cytokines, the cells release a variety of well-defined factors that concomitantly turn off the damaging inflammation mediated by T cells and macrophages, and ultimately results in a taming down effectively of the cytokine inflammatory process, protecting tissues. Next slide. We are underpinned by a very strong intellectual property estate of over 1,100 patents granted and in application form in all the major jurisdictions, including the US, Europe, Japan, and China. And these patents cover compositions of matter, indications, as well as manufacturing processes. In terms of manufacturing, our platforms lend themselves to allogeneic, scalable, commercial, off-the-shelf therapeutics, which through a manufacturing process meet stringent criteria of international regulatory agencies. We have robust quality assurance processes ensuring final product meets batch-to-batch consistency and reproducibility with appropriate potency assays. As we project increasing capacity requirements for our maturing pipeline, we have proprietary animal-free technologies that will increase yields and output, moving to three-dimensional bioreactors to reduce labor costs and improve manufacturing efficiencies. And together, these innovations significantly reduce cost of goods and allow us to meet the commercial capacity requirements of the large indications we're targeting. Next slide. Let me touch on our first platform, remestemcel. Remestemcel is focusing on, as I said earlier, the complications of steroid-refractory acute graft-versus-host disease. This is a serious and very often fatal complication of an allogeneic bone marrow transplant in patients who are otherwise have received cancer chemotherapy. Graft-versus-host disease is a three-phase process where the foreign bone marrow recognizes the donor tissues as foreign. There is an immune activation phase where T cells and macrophages are activated and release a cytokine storm that effectively then moves to the third phase, where these cytokines damage and destroy the major organs that are involved in this disease, including the gut and the liver, which results in the potentially fatal complications. Next slide. We're focusing on children because there are no agents approved to treat children under the age of 12 with this devastating complication. And when steroids have failed, the complication of gut and liver disease results in a mortality rate that approaches 70 to 90%. A truly devastating complication in children who are otherwise have been cured of their underlying leukemia. Now, we've generated data across 3 studies, a small randomized controlled study, an expanded access program, and a more recent phase 3 trial, single-arm open-label study. Together, the data across these 3 studies in over 300 children have demonstrated a remarkable consistency in terms of the primary endpoint of day 28 overall response being of the order of 65 to 69%, and a survival outcome at day 100 that approaches 80%, 79 to 80%. In contrast, when we compared our results to best available care in children comparable in severity to our phase 3 trial results, day 28 responses in those children in a cohort called the MAGIC cohort demonstrated an overall day 28 response of only 43% and a day 100 survival rate of only 67%. So, sorry, 57%, which I think gives us a real insight into the benefits potentially of remestemcel in this very vulnerable patient population. Next slide. And when compared to a very large single center study of steroid-refractory GvHD outcomes in children, and you can see this is a publication from last year of 370 patients, you can see the very dismal survival outcomes in these children. At 6 months, less than 50% of children are alive, and by 24 months, the overall survival is only 35%. In contrast, in our phase 3 trial, 69% of children were alive through 6 months, and being alive at 6 months very much predicts long-term survival and great outcomes. Next slide. So where are we in respect of the regulatory and commercial update for this product for GvHD? In August last year, the results were presented to the Oncology Drugs Advisory Committee panel of the FDA, and the ODAC panel voted 9-1 that the available data supported the efficacy of remestemcel in patients with in pediatric patients with steroid-refractory GvHD. Despite the overwhelming positive ODAC vote, unfortunately, the FDA provided Mesoblast with a complete response letter. We continue to be in discussions with the FDA through a well-established regulatory process that may include a resubmission with a 6-month review with the aim of achieving approval for remestemcel in the treatment of steroid-refractory GvHD in children. As part of this process, Mesoblast recently met with the FDA's CBER, Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research. Following CBER's recommendation after this meeting, Mesoblast, as a next step, will discuss with the CBER review team at OTAT our approach to address certain outstanding CMC items, including potency assay validation. Moving across to a second major indication for remestemcel, which is acute respiratory distress syndrome due to COVID-19. This continues to be a major unmet need, even as the vaccines take hold. And of course, ARDS is a well-established cause of morbidity and mortality in patients due to a variety of infectious agents, including influenza and bacterial infection. So this is a major focus for us as a company, as we believe that some of the pathophysiologic mechanisms of lung destruction due to an overactive immune system resemble closely the underlying pathophysiology of GvHD. Next slide. And so the clinical experience with remestemcel in COVID-19 ARDS is highlighted on this slide. A year ago or so, we explored the use of remestemcel in ventilator-dependent COVID-19 ARDS patients. 11 patients were treated under the emergency IND, and 10 out of these 11 were under the age of 65 on ventilators with moderate or severe ARDS. And these patients received 2 infusions of remestemcel, 2 million cells per kilogram within 5 days at New York's Mount Sinai Hospital. That dosage was based on the dosing regimen where in GvHD we continue at that dose, 2 doses per week, but for 4 weeks. So this is roughly a quarter of the dose used in GvHD. In that pilot study, 9 of the 11 patients successfully came off ventilators and were discharged within a median time of 10 days. This experience formed the basis for moving forward with a randomized phase 3 controlled trial in COVID ARDS. And in that study, up to 300 patients were scheduled to be randomized to either placebo or to 2 infusions of remestemcel. Notably, we had a pre-specified review on data outcomes by age less than or greater than 65, with the understanding from the outset that in fact the dosing regimen that had been introduced into the study had only been really evaluated in patients under the age of 65. Unfortunately, when 222 patients had been enrolled, the DSMB advised us that we were unlikely to meet the primary endpoint of a 43% overall mortality reduction, and the trial was then halted. The preliminary results that I'm going to be showing you are based on 60-day patient follow-up post-randomization. Notably, during the conduct of this trial, the median age increased from 59 in the first half of the treated patients to 67 in the second half. So progressively, the enrolled patients became older and older in this study. Next slide. Now, during the conduct of the trial, many things changed, of course, as the ARDS pandemic evolved. But in particular, what did change was the institution of dexamethasone as standard of care in all ventilated patients. Otherwise, a whole range of other drugs came and went. None of them really made any substantial difference to the outcomes of ventilated patients with ARDS. Next slide. And as you can see on this slide, age is the single best predictor of mortality in COVID-19 patients who are on ventilators with ARDS. The 3 large bars on the right demonstrate mortality rates between 70 and 84% in patients above 65. 3 large gray bars on the left, mortality rates between 47 and about 50% in patients under 65. Still large mortality rates, but clearly demarcated difference between above and below 65. Rationale, the reason being that the older patients have defects in immune pathways that handle the viral load, are unable to clear the virus efficiently. That results in a very, very ineffective immune response and a subsequently very aggressive cytokine storm. In various pandemics and epidemics of influenza virus, the majority of patients, up to 80% of patients on ventilators in ICUs, have been of below the age of 65. And we expect that as the COVID pandemic moves to an endemic phase, it will be the same in across the US. Most patients with new infections will be under the age of 65. What we saw in our trial, as in every other trial, generally speaking, of ventilated patients, age mattered substantially. So patients over 65, control patients over 65 had mortality rates in the 70% range. Patients under 65 had 60-day mortality rather in the range of around 42%. This was highly significant, as expected. Next, in terms of the overall treatment in the 217 treated patients, we saw about a 15% reduction in mortality rate in the remestemcel treated patients, which, as we said earlier, did not meet the pre-specified threshold that was set for the trial overall. Next slide. But what was particularly exciting was a 46% reduction in mortality through 60 days in patients under the age of 65, 123 patients who made up the bulk of the majority of the study. The hazard ratio there was 0.54. In contrast, we saw no survival benefit in the patients over the age of 65, where the mortality rate was of the order of 71 to 72%. And in particular, what was even more exciting was that on top of dexamethasone, which became the standard of care about a third of the way through the study, we saw a 75% reduction in overall mortality in those under the age of 65, from 45% in those treated with dexamethasone alone to 14% in those treated with dexamethasone plus 2 doses of our cells within 5 days. So from our point of view, it appears that the dosing regimen that was selected on the basis of the 11 patients, 10 of whom were under 65 in the pilot study, were confirmed in this particular study. And our conclusion is that that is an appropriate dose for improving survival outcomes in this in younger patients. With respect to those over 65, we clearly need to do further exploratory analyses of an appropriate dosing range to see whether we can get a similar outcome benefit in older patients. Next slide. So overall, we now have a plan to meet with the FDA to discuss potential next steps in patients under the age of 65, where we've seen a substantial mortality benefit. And we expect that a confirmatory trial in this population will evaluate our cells on top of dexamethasone, as well as to evaluate exploratory dosing at a higher dose regimens for those who are over the age of 65. Next slide. And finally, the next couple of slides touch on our cardiac and inflammatory back pain programs. In terms of our heart failure program, the existing therapeutics reduce recurrent hospitalizations due to decompensation and volume overload, and therefore patients who require diuretics and the like. However, they do not materially improve cardiac mortality or major ischemic events. Those are inflammatory mediated outcomes where we think that our cells have a particular relevant mechanism of action. And to remind everybody that, in fact, mortality approaches 50% at 5 years in patients with advanced heart failure, very similar to many cancers. Next slide. Mechanism of action is unique in that these cells reduce inflammation within the myocardium and in extracardiac large vessels. Next slide. And what we saw in our phase 3 program of 537 patients was a 60% reduction in overall risk of heart attacks and strokes, and a 30% reduction in the so-called 3-point MACE of cardiac death, heart attacks, or strokes compared to controls. And in particular, in the earlier stage patients with advanced class 2 disease in transition towards class 3, in fact, a 55% reduction in the 3-point MACE. And this is really where we see a big difference relative to other standard of care, driven by both reduction in cardiac mortality as well as reduction in heart attacks and strokes. And this is the basis of discussions that we have ongoing with the FDA and with potential strategic partners. So our proposed approach here, the patient journey, is that we believe a single injection of our cells in patients with advanced class 2-3 disease will be used to support long-term reduction in mortality and major ischemic events in conjunction with ongoing therapy with any of the number of new agents, including sacubitril, valsartan, and the SGLT2 inhibitors. And my final couple of slides relate to our chronic low back pain program, a large program of 391 patients randomized 2-to-1 to cells with or without a carrier, and versus placebo. These are patients who are otherwise exhausted in terms of therapies for reducing pain, chronic inflammatory low back pain, intervertebral disc disease, and 40% of whom were actually on active opioid use at baseline. Next slide, please. The results showed a significant reduction in pain that was durable at both 12 months and at 24 months relative to placebo. These effects were even more pronounced in those patients with less than 5 years of pain. So conclusion from this study, at every time point tested, a significant reduction in pain relative to placebo in those patients with less than 5 years of symptomatology, which demonstrates to us that the earlier you can get in at a time when you've still got severe inflammation and you've got tissue that you can protect, the better the outcome. Next slide. And finally, the 40% of patients on opioid use at baseline demonstrated substantial reduction in pain throughout a 24-month period of follow-up, together with up to 40% reduction in opioid usage through 24 months, despite the fact that they were clearly instructed not to change their medications, as well as their physicians. So we're very encouraged by the data that we've seen. And again, these data support ongoing discussions with strategic partners, as well as upcoming discussions with the FDA. I think the final slide really talks to the exciting milestones that are upcoming over the next 6 months for both remestemcel and rexlemestrocel. And I've touched on the FDA interactions with remestemcel that we hope will result in our ability to refile for approval for pediatric GvHD, as well as the potential to move forward for COVID ARDS. And for rexlemestrocel, important discussions with both FDA and EMA on back pain and our cardiac program. And on that note, I think welcome to address any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Tescu. That was a very interesting presentation about some very interesting technologies. The first question I had was about remestemcel in GvHD. And I was hoping you could discuss the process and the regulatory pathway after the complete response letter.
Sure. So the complete response letter had two components. The first was the requirement potentially of another randomized controlled trial, despite the fact that the ODAC panel voted 9-to-1, that the data presented at the panel was sufficient to convince them that there was significant efficacy in children with steroid-refractory GvHD. The second component was to come to agreement on several CMC items that still remained outstanding. We've pursued a well-established process with the FDA post the CRL and have had ongoing discussions. Most recently, several weeks ago, the guidance from the most recent meeting was to set up as soon as possible a meeting with the review team to get our CMC data sets aligned. And assuming we can do that, that we'll be in a position potentially to refile for approval under the BLA.
Can you explain what the FDA is seeking from Mesoblast in terms of an additional potency assay to ensure batch-to-batch consistency and any future trials or regulatory submissions?
Yeah, look, I think it's clear that the product is safe. In our view, it's effective. We can demonstrate consistency of the product. I think the FDA would like an additional potency assay that demonstrates a clear link to the mechanism of action in vitro, and that relates to how the cells actually impact the immune system, that relates to ultimately the clinical outcomes data. And we have that in hand, and we will present our data as soon as we're able to have a meeting with the review team. But I think we're very confident that we have an understanding of what is expected and the data to support and build on top of the existing matrix of assays that are already in place. I think further assay that allows us to, in the future, demonstrate that at a commercial scale, each product that goes out the door has a consistent efficacy and mechanism to correlate with what we've seen already in phase 3.
In the COVID-19 ARDS trial, this past December, the Data Safety and Monitoring Board suggested that remestemcel in that indication should not continue to recruit, but should continue to follow those patients who had already been enrolled. Now that you've unblinded the data, can you describe some of the key findings and any important conclusions from the trial?
Yeah, there's some incredibly important conclusions from the trial. We're very pleased that we followed the patients out through 60 days and now 90 days. And the pre-specified cutoff of age above and below 65 has given us very important information that demonstrates that at the dose tested, which was really a quarter dose of what the product is used at in GvHD, we see up to a 75% reduction in mortality within 60 days in patients under 65 on dexamethasone, on top of dexamethasone. So that's a dramatic reduction in mortality. And there are, to my knowledge, no other agents that have shown anything like that kind of an improvement in survival in ventilated patients who have moderate or severe ARDS. We didn't see a similar benefit in those over 65, and what I think that means, in the same way as many agents have not shown any benefit in the older patients. That's a group of patients who have a defect in their ability to clear the virus, and as a result have a very aggressive immune response that is overwhelmingly destroys the lung, and that reflects the high mortality rates in the elderly. And I think we will be exploring in the future higher doses or more sustained dosing in that patient population. But with respect to the under 65s, which today account for over 70% of ventilated patients across the US, and increasing because that's the group of younger people where the continued viral spread will be occurring. In that population, I think we've identified that the dosing that was tested gives us quite a dramatic survival benefit. And we expect to be having discussions with the FDA around those outcomes over the next few weeks.
One of the things you mentioned was your collaboration with Novartis. Last year, you formed an agreement with them, and could you give some of the details and major points about the agreement and how Novartis can add to your platform?
Yeah, so Novartis, we've entered into an agreement with Novartis. It is still not yet closed, subject to Novartis's final review of the data. They're currently reviewing the data as we speak. But as I would expect that on closing of this transaction, they will be a terrific partner. And their primary area of interest actually is in inflammatory lung disease, not necessarily only COVID-ARDS, but actually non-COVID-ARDS, which is a well-established problem for which there are limited options. Dexamethasone again is more and more used in non-COVID ARDS due to influenza virus, pneumonia, bacterial infections, and the like. And I think the lessons learned from this study with COVID-ARDS will be very useful as we put together a program for non-COVID-ARDS, more broadly speaking, both in the US and globally. So I think we're working with a strategic partner potentially that has a lot of insight to bring to the table, and we look forward to moving that program forward in greater detail.
Yes, I agree. One of the things about COVID is that ARDS is part of the illness and one of many things that happens to these patients, but ARDS has been around for a long time and nothing is really effective. So there's a lot of potential outside of COVID.
Yeah, it's a big unmet medical need. I mean, as many as 60 to 70,000 people a year in the US die from ARDS due to influenza, despite the fact that we have perfectly adequate vaccines. Part of the reason for that is many people don't get vaccinated, as you know, and oftentimes even when you do get vaccinated, you've got the wrong mixture of strains in the vaccine. There's constant evolution, there's constant mutational rates, and I think exactly the same issue is going to be on an ongoing basis with COVID. So, you know, therapies that ultimately reduce the inflammation in the lung in patients who are ventilated with these respiratory infections are critical in order to reduce mortality rates.
Yes, agreed. One of the other programs you mentioned was the lower back pain program. Could you just briefly discuss some of the conclusions and some of the milestones ahead for that program?
Yeah, certainly. Look, we in a well-controlled randomized study, we saw these are patients who very tough to treat inflammatory intervertebral disc disease, 40% of whom were on opioids at baseline. These patients really have no alternatives. They've failed epidural injections of steroids, etc. What we've seen is a substantial and significant reduction in pain at 12 and at 24 months in a very traditional way of measuring changes in pain, in a way that a much greater impact and for much longer than you get with alternative therapeutics like opioids, for example. In addition, we were able to identify those patients where maximal therapeutic benefit was seen, and those are patients within the first 5 years of their symptoms. So that identifies where we should be treating and who we should be treating. And of course, the sooner you can get into this patient population, the greater the therapeutic benefit, because on the one hand, you know, this is a chronic disease and it's a disabling disease. But on the other hand, you want to tackle it at its maximal point of inflammation before you've actually had destruction of the disc. You don't want patients to move towards requiring surgery, for example. And so we've identified the optimal time period. In addition to that, in the 40% of patients who are on opioids at baseline, whilst they had substantial improvement that was durable, in addition to that, despite the fact that both they and their physicians were told not to make changes to their therapies, 40% reduction in opioid usage was seen over a 24-month period, which is quite exciting to see. And so we will be having discussions with the FDA also over the next couple of months around what the best pathway forward for the overall patient population, as well as for that group that is opioid dependent. I think given the epidemic of opioid use across the US, especially as it's been amplified by COVID-19, I think this is a very important discussion point with the agency. So we will be having those discussions, and together with our partner Grünenthal in Europe, we'll be putting together a global program that hopefully gets us towards approval in both the US and Europe, you know, in the same time frame.
Yes, I completely agree. And of all the clinical measures of benefit that you mentioned, the idea that you can reduce opioid use, that's a great measure of whether the patient sees a benefit or not. They feel less pain, they use less opioids.
Yeah, look, it's not small time. It's substantial, and it's important, in terms of outcomes. So we will be that will be central to our discussion with the FDA around how to incorporate opioid usage into our endpoints as we move forward.
Lastly, my final question is on the FDA and the regulatory process. And Biogen just received an approval for aducanumab, which has created a lot of discussion in the industry and on the whole regulatory process in general. Are there any takeaways or conclusions that you see from Mesoblast or the industry as a whole?
Yeah, look, I'm not a neuroscientist by background, but what I think this demonstrates to me is the general flexibility exhibited by the FDA in novel therapeutics for diseases that have no alternatives, for diseases that have tremendous unmet needs. And I think in part, we at Mesoblast are developing novel therapies precisely for these large unmet needs for which traditional medicines haven't done much. And the lessons to me in this outcome is very much for our heart failure program, for example, where we've seen a substantial reduction in cardiac mortality and other major outcomes such as recurrent MIs, and where we're exploring biomarker data that substantiate the mechanism of action that potentially give us interim data sets that will correlate and predict reduction in mortality in a disease that has a similar mortality rate to cancers. So it's the flexibility that the FDA has shown that I think we can learn from, and hopefully put in place a program that meets similar kind of thresholds.
Thank you for joining us for this C-Suite interview presentation brought to you by Channel Check. Visit our YouTube channel for more interview content, as well as virtual roadshows and conference presentation replays. New content is added regularly, so subscribe below to stay up to date. Visit channelcheck.com or click the link in the description to access equity research, news, and advanced market data on this and the 6,000 other small and micro-cap companies listed.